I'm Megan. Thanks for joining me for somatics today. We're going to be working in my favorite physical part of the body, which is the pelvis, the center of our universe, as I refer to it. And we're going to specifically go through the way the pelvis moves, which we call the planes of the pelvis. And these are the movements that we want to feel like we can do freely and comfortably in order to walk, hike, run, anything where our legs are moving. And what we also often find out is that we could have pain in the knees and the ankles or even in the shoulders and the neck. Pain could be above or below the pelvis, but oftentimes the imbalance or the restriction is not in the joint where we feel the pain. The restriction is in the pelvis itself. So we're going to be working through doing some movements that really isolate the movements of the pelvis. But before we do that, let's find out what these planes of the pelvis are with taking them into a more natural rhythmic movement. So I'm going to turn sideways. The first one we're going to do is called anterior posterior tilting. So you might just find the bony landmarks of your pelvis first. So feel the front of the pelvis and the back. You don't have to know all the names of them. Just feel around and think of it as a bowl or girdle, whichever term you prefer. We've got the bottom of the bowl, the pelvic floor, your sits bones, your ischial tuberosities, and just get familiar with this shape. And then imagine that you're walking in place, or if you walk off camera, that's fine. So we're going to do this arching and curling. So I like to call it the arching or the anterior tilt is your tailbone will lift up. I call it duck butt. You're making a duck butt. Your low back will compress and the belly will stretch, or the front of the pubic area will stretch. And then we go the other way. The tailbone goes down. That's the dog in trouble. The tail goes between the legs if the dog were in trouble, and the belly will compress. The low back's long, right? So that happens as we walk. So take a step forward and just notice when you step forward as your weight's coming into that front foot, do you feel a little bit of that duck butt? You might feel your pelvis lift up. We're going really slow just to feel. And then step the next foot right next to it, and we kind of go back into that dog tail, the low back lengthens. And then step with the other foot. See if you feel just a little bit of a shortening through the low back, the anterior tilt, and then step the other foot next to it. So we're just familiarizing the natural rhythmic movement, and it'll be small. If you want, you can close your eyes, or you can take it a little bit further than whatever normal is. So really think of lifting the tailbone as you're slowly bringing the weight into that front foot, and let the tail drop. Notice if you feel restriction or tightness in one side more than the other. So we're using the whole leg line, though, in movement to get the pelvis to go through this arch and curl. And that is the sagittal plane. So the next plane of movement that we're going to go through with the pelvis is called the coronal plane. And so the coronal plane is about the hip when we go to take a step. One hip has to lift up. Actually, I'll turn this way. So one hip is going to lift, which means the other one is below, right? As above, so below. If something goes up, something else goes down. And I'm exaggerating that, and you might want to too, but feel this as you're taking that step forward. Keep your hands on your pelvis. Feel what muscles are helping you to lift the foot off the ground, and then it drops down, and then the other side. So if you were to just kind of take nice, soft, small steps, feel that lifting of the hip. You'll feel a shortening perhaps through your waist, right around your waistband. Walking kind of funny. If anybody's watching you, don't feel like you have to explain yourself. Just feel this. Moving through the coronal plane. So it's like the hips are tilting, one upward and one downward. And just see how that feels for you as the pelvis responds to the legs moving and the legs respond to the pelvis, hopefully also moving. Just looking for restriction or tightness as you walk kind of funny. And then the last of the planes of the pelvis that we're going to play with today is called the transverse plane. Transverse plane is more of a rotational movement. So as you're bringing that duck butt in and stepping a foot forward, there's also not just the foot, but the hip should come forward. So the rotation comes in the hip coming forward, which means that the other hip is back. And then we step forward again. One hip's forward, one's back. So sometimes you'll see people like really swing their hips, right? One forward, one back, and you could do that. See how it feels? But feel yourself through that plane of movement, that transverse plane of one hip forward and one's back, and allowing the hips and the legs and maybe even the shoulders respond. I'm having to keep your hands here, but notice what that feels like for your body. Is there any restriction, or sometimes you'll feel discomfort somewhere below in your body when you start to make these movements from the pelvis? Okay, so that's the first part. We want to know what those movements are and how they play out in our gait. But now we're going to restrict the lower body, and we're going to play with those movements again. So that means we're isolating the pelvic movements. So turning sideways first, you can still keep your hands and feel the bony landmarks in your pelvis. And now I'm just going to do the inhale, duck butt. I can do it to my breath now. As I exhale, dog tail. So it's the anterior tilt. My pelvis is like a bowl spilling forward, and my tailbone lifts up. And then my pelvis is spilling backwards. And I'm doing my best not to let my legs move too much. I don't want to lock my knees. I'm going to keep soft knees. But I want to see what kind of restriction is there if I'm not stepping. Can I still just feel this what we sometimes call the arch and curl in the pelvis? Sometimes this is one, like for me, when I come into that arch, I'll feel some compression in my low back where I have some of my pain. So I'm just aware of that. But I'll also sometimes feel it in my inner left knee. So you may notice things like that. Check the joints below and even above. So that's our arch and curl when we're not moving our legs or our sagittal plane. And then the next one we'll do without moving the legs. So it's like our feet, we've got this nice stance to look forward to, because sometimes, a lot of times when we're standing, we don't pay attention. Do you ever stand like this? I used to do this all the time, usually with a baby on my hip. So not surprisingly, my left hip for a long time was lower than my right hip, because look how I'm standing, left hip below the right and forward. And I also had a rotational imbalance. So we can have those. We can have one hip imbalance in the pelvis might show as an anterior posterior tilt, like we're too far into our low back. This is what we call green light reflex in somatics. It could also be that dog tail. So it could be duck butt all the time. It could be dog tail all the time. But it can also be an imbalance with the next plane that we're going to do, which is that coronal plane. So we're going to keep the feet underneath us and just allow the hip to lift. One hip, so you're going to be kind of restricted. Just imagine lifting a hip and dropping it, and the other hip and dropping it. And the tendency is going to be to want to lift your foot up. Do your best to keep your feet on the ground. All you want to do is feel like if somebody were to grab your left belt buckle, you're going to lift that belt buckle and drop it and lift the other belt buckle. And if your heel lifts a little bit, that's all right. But feel like you're using the muscles and the side of your waist. So we're definitely restricting it now from when we were taking that step, right? But I want you to familiarize your muscles that are helping you to lift one hip, and in lifting one hip, the other is dropping. And just feeling that side to side through your side body. So again, one of the imbalances is we might consistently have one hip higher than the other. And we call that the trauma reflex, when one side of the body is longer or shorter. So for me, my right side was shorter, my left side was longer. Partially, I stood like this all the time. So that's something we look for, and that's always going to show in the pelvis. It's almost, you can't, if one shoulder is higher than the other, and you can look at yourself and see that clearly in the mirror, check your pelvis, because more than likely the pelvis is in a imbalance in this coronal plane as well. So that's just something to look for. Then the last plane that we're going to do is that transverse plane. So transverse plane, again, just keep your feet planted like they're in cement, but try to take one hip forward and notice how the other one naturally goes back, and then relax. I'll turn sideways for this one. And then the other hip forward. It's these tiny little movements. One hip and then the other, and you're just checking. How does that feel for you? Taking one and then the other, and familiarizing yourself with the muscles in and around the pelvis. So are you really jabbing into your leg muscles? Can you keep your leg muscles soft and just notice how it feels for the pelvis. And this is in that transverse plane. So again, another imbalance is we're stuck in a transverse plane where one hip is slightly forward. There's a permanent rotation to the hips, and that's very common too. It's a trauma reflex. It can happen from accidents or overuse in sports, whatever, injuries. So that's also common. So just noticing if like one hip might be stickier than the other coming forward. And then we'll pause for a moment. So now I'm going to have you grab either a stack of books or a block, whatever you got there, that will pick you up a little bit. So we're going to play with that a little bit more. I'm going to take the block down. But now I'm going to take my right foot onto the block, and I'll do my left leg first. And I'm going to hold on to the wall because this is not a balance test. We want to lift up, and we'll go through those planes again. But this time the trick is, notice when you get on that block, the left hip will drop. I'm going to turn sideways so you can see. The left hip is going to naturally drop, so you're already in this tilt. I want you to feel those bony landmarks and lift the left hip up. So even though your left foot's not on a block or a book, imagine it is. Do your best to keep the pelvis in alignment so my heels are at the same height. And that's why it's really helpful to hold the wall or a chair, something. So you want to keep those heels at the same height and try again to do your pelvic tilting back and forth. So it's arching into the duck butt and curling into the dog that's in trouble, tail between the legs. And going back and forth. And you'll notice how much strength it takes in that right hip and thigh to hold this. But watch for any tendency to just start to drop that left hip. And just do a couple on this side. Testing and noticing. And then drop that left foot down. And this is like independent suspension for the hips too, right? We're working one side. Now you're going to go on the other side, so you're going to stand on the block with the left foot. Lift that right leg up, so as if you were standing on a block on both feet. Try to keep the shoulders over the hips as best you can, so I'm not leaning into the wall. And then I'm going to do that anterior, posterior tilt. So moving through the sagittal plane, duck butt. I much prefer to call it duck butt and dog tail than sagittal plane. Those words are too fancy for me. I can vision it. I can see my duck butt, or I have chickens, my rooster feathers, and back down. And maybe one side was more restrictive than the other. Or I also find for me is, this is my right side is my tight side. So when I'm trying to do this one, this right hip keeps trying to crawl up and tighten, because that's where it's used to being. That's that sensory motor amnesia. It's tight and it won't release. So I really have to work at keeping the hips level. All right. And then we'll come off again. Nice little workout for your left thigh there, right? So now we're going to turn, take the right foot down. We're going to go through the coronal plane again. But this time you're standing on your right foot. So you're going to lift that left leg up and let the whole leg line come with, but you should be able to isolate the movement more from your hip. Come forward and then back. Bring that left hip forward and back. And as the left hip goes back, the right hip comes forward, and vice versa. Watch again. So what we're really watching for as we're doing this is it difficult to keep the hips level? Is there a tendency to want to drop that left hip or lift it, one or the other, right? So keeping the hips level as you do this. It's a little bit of a workout here, back and forth, or that rotational movement. I'm sorry, this is a transverse plane. We're doing transverse first this time. That rotational movement. And then drop down. Let's just try the other side. See if it's the same thing, or if one side is stickier or grippy. Sometimes there's like a tightness, a stuckness. Stack, so lift your heel up, stack, and then right hip forward and back. So you're rotating the pelvis. Right hip comes forward and then back. And again, for me on this side, I have to watch that I'm not lifting that hip up. That's my tight side. So I'm trying to keep it even, but you may find that you're trying to drop that hip. That's not good either. Just back and forth. And it helps to lift the ball of the foot off the ground a little bit. So my right foot is in the same position as my left foot, as if I was standing on the ground. Back and forth. And then take that down. All right, a little out of order. Now we'll go back to the coronal plane, which is the lifting of the hip. So we'll take the right foot back to the block. So this one, we don't necessarily keep them, or we won't keep them even, the pelvis. Hand to the wall, and when you're ready, you're going to purposely imagine a string. This is where you got that string on your belt loop. Lift up the left hip, and then let it come all the way down. So now we want that to happen. But watch that the hip is just going up and down, that it's not coming forward. Or sometimes we'll see, in order to lift it up, we go into that dog tail, and you want to keep the neutral position of the low back, that natural arch, and lift and drop. So we watch to see, can we isolate just this hip lift and drop without having to do the other ones, and can you move from the hip? That's probably about enough for that one, right? Right leg burning yet? And then let's switch. So coming onto the left leg, lift that right foot up to initially stack your shoulders. And the other thing I'm trying to be really cautious of is that my head's not way forward. I want to keep my ponytail on my nose over my pelvis, the center of my nose. And then I'm lifting and dropping. And you may find that one side of the pelvis, it's much easier to lift. That's going to tell you that's your strong side. It's probably your short side too, if you have a short side. So for me, it's really easy to lift this side. This is my short, strong, quote, tight side. And then we're dropping down. And just feeling your way through that. Okay. And then come off the block. So that's the first part of our practice, just explaining those 3 planes of the pelvis and how we can check for imbalances, as well as use those as tools to correct those imbalances. Now we're going to go down onto the floor, and we're going to get a little bit deeper in there and work with those planes of the pelvis. So feel free to put anything down on your mat that makes you more comfortable, and I'll see you down there. All the way down on the ground now, resting. The ground literally has your back and is supporting you, so we can focus on the pelvis. And because sometimes those movements we just did can build some tension in the legs, let's take a full body yawn. Take your arms overhead and reach your legs long. Tighten all the muscles to the bones while you're stretching. Hold that for just a few breaths. You can feel your back arch. That's your anterior tilt of your pelvis. And exhale, let go. Take your arms back down to your sides. We'll go the other way. Hug your knees into your chest and squeeze into a little ball. You can rock on your low back. There's your dog tail, your posterior tilt of your pelvis. And just feeling that. And then we come into constructive rest. So feet to the ground. My hips, my knees, and my ankles are in the same line, and I still like to use my hands on my pelvis. They're feelers for the nervous system, and just to sense those bony landmarks. So taking that pelvic tilting to the ground, we can now feel the back side of the body. So the way I like to move somatically is first to acknowledge the breath and breathe into your belly, and notice how your belly feels like a balloon as you breathe in. And as you breathe out, it naturally draws back in and empties. So there's a recoil. So we find the breath first, and then we can move to the breath. Feel where your tailbone was, and a duck butt on the ground will feel like pressing your tailbone into the ground, and it'll still create that arch in the low back. And then the other side of that is the dog tail on exhalation will feel like you're tucking your tail between your thighs or lifting it up towards the sky. So moving from the tailbone, if I think of moving from the tailbone, I'm pressing the tailbone into the ground as I breathe in and lifting the tailbone up as I breathe out. And that's creating that anterior tilt forward. The pelvis is tilting forward. And posterior tilt, the pelvis is tilting back and towards my navel center. So, but there's different ways. So now we're looking at this movement through the sagittal plane as how can we make it comfortable for ourselves. So we can push into the ground with the tailbone on the inhale. We can also pull away from the ground with the tailbone on the exhale. But what happens if we work with the low back? Then on the inhale, we can lift away, instead of pushing into, lift away from the ground on the inhale, and push into the ground on the exhale with the low back. Think of low back and low ribs. So 2 ways to create force to find this pelvic movement, this tilt, this posterior anterior tilt, is to push into the ground or pull away from the ground, or any combination of the 2. And just do this to find what feels good and begin to notice how the muscles are working, mainly through the front and the back of the pelvis. So abdominal muscles stretching on the inhale as the back muscles compress, tighten, and shorten. And on the exhalation, the abdominal muscles will compress, tighten, and shorten, and the low back will lengthen or stretch. So that's the relationship. We can also look at the bottom of our pelvic bowl, the pelvic floor. And the pelvic floor muscles are doing the same thing as the abdominal muscles. They're the twins. As we inhale, the pelvic floor muscles stretch. And as we exhale, the pelvic floor muscles recoil or contract like the abdomen. And you can make that more forceful or draw them in purposely if you'd like, and then release them on the inhale, just like you do with the belly. So strengthening that smoothness, that freedom of anterior posterior tilt. And we're also noticing that we want to keep the legs relaxed. So I'm not pushing into the feet or squeezing my thighs. Keep the leg muscles relaxed to really isolate the movement in the pelvis. As you start to do this and find more freedom, one of the ways you'll know, and if you do my videos, you've probably done this 100 times, because this is really the magic pill for me for so many pelvic issues and low back problems. But you'll know that what happens is it's not just the pelvis. So this is where we start to see that reciprocity in the body, because as soon as I start to rock the pelvis like this, my head responds, my neck responds, and it goes the same direction as the pelvis. So pelvis tilts forward and upward, and so does the head. And as the pelvis tilts back, the head tilts back. So just notice in yourself that if that naturally occurred, that it's like your tail is going one way and your nose is chasing it on the inhale, and then your nose is going back and your tail is chasing it. So if you visualize a string from your tailbone to your nose, and they're just going one way and the other together. And that's the amazing thing. We start to recognize how the pelvis really sets the course for our whole spine, right? Because it's responsible for taking the weight of the entire upper body, particularly the sacrum, the bone that holds the pelvis together, takes all the weight of the upper body, and it has to distribute it into each of the hips and down the legs. So just enjoying this moment of pelvic tilting and finding the most easeful way to create this. What muscle combination can you use in your pelvis? And finding that muscle combination by pushing into and or pulling away from the ground. Just take a few more and enjoy. And then we'll pause. Just take your legs out long for a moment. Relax. Take a few breaths to feel. You can even think about those movements we were doing. Okay, so we're ready to go through the next movement, which is the coronal plane. And you're going to bend just your left leg and leave your right leg long. But what I tell you is that when you took your legs long, if your low back came into that duck butt, if there's a big arch and there's pulling or any sort of tightness underneath your low back, put a bolster, a pillow, something underneath your right leg as you bend your left knee. So you can relax that right leg. It's on holiday. And use your hands to feel those landmarks of your left hip this time. We're going to focus on the left hip. Feel your breath and imagine that somebody's got that belt loop again. So this is the coronal plane is the hip lift. So you're going to inhale and lift the left hip towards the left armpit. You'll feel a shortening through your left side. Or what I should say is, because we're on the ground, it's a slide. Sometimes when I say lift, people think lift the left hip up off the floor. That's actually the rotation. We'll do that one next. You're going to slide it, right? Think of when you were standing on that left leg and you had to bring it towards your shoulder, the hip, and then release on exhale. So we're not lifting the pelvis off the ground. Both the right and the left side of the pelvis are staying on the ground. You're sliding it up and you'll feel those sideways muscles that have to do that for you. And then release those sideways muscles. Sometimes this one's hard to find at first. And if that's the case for you, you can push into your left foot just a little bit to help that little squeeze, like you're squeezing your left waist, and then release. And notice if it does release, that's important. So this is that hip lift. This would be, if we were walking, you can imagine, this is the leg that's about to step forward. You got to lift the foot off the ground before it can step forward. And these are the muscles. It's not just the muscles in the legs, right? We want these side body muscles to help to bring the left hip towards the armpit. In fact, if you want to add on to this a little bit, one of the things I like to do is to bring my left armpit towards the hip. So to purposely contract beyond whatever is normal contraction or tightness, this left side on inhale, and then release completely on exhale. So if you remember standing, when whatever way one hip goes, the other does the opposite, right? So as the left hip is shortening, the right hip is lengthening, or the top of the right hip. So I like to also take advantage of that by taking my right arm overhead and think the left hip is doing the action, but I'm getting that lengthening through the right side, which my right side needs, maybe yours does too, as the left side contracts. I can even feel it through my shoulder. I'm tightening that whole left side. So I mentioned trauma reflex earlier. That's when one side of the body is shorter. So for me, my right side is shorter. So this feels really good for me. This is my longer side. So I'm compressing it and tightening the left side. But what's more important is just letting go to that space of grace, regardless of which side there might be any sort of imbalance in, or irregularities, which really are not irregular because we all have them. Should probably strike that word from our mouth when we're doing somatics. There is no irregular, there is no wrong. Everything counts. Just your awareness of the muscles tightening and then releasing. And so I didn't mention too, if I know that I'm doing this in flow and my body, my whole body is cooperating, I will get this natural desire to roll my head towards my left shoulder as I tighten the left side. And I don't ask why, I just let it happen because I know that my neck is quite tight with the, and not tight contracted, tight meaning friends, close relatives with the pelvis. So it responds to the pelvic movement and it just wants me to roll my head. And I say yes. One or two more for that side. And then we'll pause. I'm going to stay on this side so you can see what it looks like for the opposite side. But we're going to switch right over so you can, if you've got, if you had something underneath the right leg, take it underneath your left leg. Take that left leg long. It's on holiday. Let it relax. Right foot to the ground. Knee bent. So I've got my hip, my knee, and my ankle in this straight line. And then you can place your hand on the front of the right hip. So that's that, feel that hip and think of your outer belt loop. If somebody was grabbing your belt loop, or think of a puppeteer string and you're inhaling and drawing that right hip towards the right armpit without lifting. I don't want to feel a weight transfer into the left side of the pelvis. I want weight equally distributed in both sides of the hips onto the earth, but I'm going to slide it up and then release it. Sliding and releasing. And if you're doing that to your breath, I always like to make it the effort on the inhale to squeeze, and then that release to the space of grace on the exhale. Just where your body naturally wants to be. If you're no longer doing, the doing is on the inhale, drawing the hip towards the armpit. If you want to add a little more action to that, as you're inhaling, you can reach your right hand towards the right hip. So you might even feel the tightness to the shoulder and your upper waist underneath your armpit, shortening that right side. Also notice the lengthening through the left side. This is where my head wants to start turning, and I just note that. But we can also appreciate the lengthening through the left side. So in order to do that more, you might take your left arm overhead and you get into the muscles, some of the muscles of respiration. Breathing into your intercostal muscles and the left lung. Noticing how as you inhale, it's going to be a lot harder to breathe into your right side because you're compressing it. But lots of space in the left lung. These are just ways I really finesse these poses more. As I get better with the physical components of the movement, I turn it more and more into a breath center practice. Let my breath guide me. Create space through the left side by breathing into the left lung. And then maybe I don't have to use as much force to lift that right hip up. So that's the key, is finding the way that you can move with the most freedom and the least amount of force, but still creating this hip lift and drop. Letting your head respond if it would like to. And then letting go. Take the arm back down if it's overhead. Pause again, legs long, just feeling. See if you have even just more awareness of the shape of the pelvis or how it connects your torso to your legs. Breathing into that space, pelvis, base of the pelvis, the front, the soft part of the abdomen, outer hips. And then relaxing. We're going to go back to just the right knee bent and the left leg long. So switching sides again, you can put the block underneath the left thigh if you'd like. So now we go more into the rotation. So when we were standing, that meant one hip was coming forward, but now that means that one hip's going to come up towards your ceiling, towards your sky. So I'm going to put my hand on the front of my right hip. As I breathe in, I'm trying to lift my right hip off the ground. But what will often again happen is you'll push into the foot and you'll want to do this really big movement because our brain always thinks like bigger is better, right? That's not necessarily true. In fact, it's not at all right now because then I'm using my leg muscles. I could easily use my hamstrings to lift and more just the glutes, but I want to get into my outer hip muscles, my little glutes, medius and even the minimus on the outside. So I'm going to think of lifting the hip up and letting the leg stay as relaxed as possible. So we can again play with the idea of I can do this by lifting away from with the right hip. I could also do it by pressing into with the left hip. If I'm using the press into and that's successful, well, another thing you can try is to go ahead and do both knees bent. So sometimes this just works better for me, particularly on this side. Both knees bent and then lifting. So it may be easier for you to find that rotation from this space. So the way you may feel it is your sacrum is in the middle of your two hips. As you start the process, your weight is equal on both sides of the hips and the sacrum. You'll feel yourself roll through the sacrum and onto the back of the left hip, and then coming back down all the way to where there's equal weight in both sides of the pelvis again. But play with what kind of force do you want to recreate? Do you want to create? You can press the left hip down to create the force and or lift the right hip up. Maybe take a hand to your outer hips, particularly the right one. Do you feel some muscles firing in that outer right hip to lift it up? Also notice again if your head wants to respond, going one way or the other. So the way I can create a little more arch with this one, and I'll turn towards you for this, is, so that's what, we're getting a rotation, which, because we're on the floor, feels like the right side body arching away from the floor. If you think of your right shoulder blade, and as you're lifting the right hip, press the right shoulder blade into the ground, so you'll feel even more of that arching and that rotation of the right hip, and then release. So I'm pressing my right hip into the ground, lifting the right hip up, pressing my right shoulder blade into the ground, and then releasing. These practices are sometimes hard for me to verbalize because as I do them more, I get more relaxed, and then I have a hard time saying what I'm feeling. So just feel into your own body, notice. You can push down, so that any combination of pushing into and pulling away from, we're learning to use gravity to create force. And today is about doing that with the pelvis, to create movement and stability in the pelvis. Pushing down with the right shoulder, lifting with the right hip. Feel that arch. You'll feel the muscles kind of tighten through the outer right hip. And then release. One more round there. And let go. And then we'll be doing the opposite side. I'll turn towards you again. So if you found you wanted to do it with the right leg extended, you're welcome to. I'll encourage you to put a block underneath the thigh, or maybe a pillow would be nicer. Something soft and cushy. Because that was my crabby side, it really wanted me to have the other leg bent. But we're going to feel yourself from your left hip now. And it's as if you're lifting the back of the left side of the pelvis away from the ground. So you'll feel yourself roll through. Weight will go into the sacrum and then into the right hip. And then releasing back down. Lifting up and releasing down. And just notice the amount of force that's going into your foot. So sometimes I'll purposely use my foot and my leg to create the lift, because I want to notice. It's always good to notice what you don't want to do, right? So if I purposely push into my foot, it's like, okay, well, that's what it feels like if I let my leg muscles lift my pelvis. Now what if I keep my leg muscles quiet and I let my pelvic muscles lift my pelvis? It's exciting looking, but it's a whole different feeling. I can keep the muscles of my leg relaxed. I'm not pushing my foot into the earth. I'm feeling a tightening in the outer hip, and then letting it go. But also that option to not only lift the left hip, but push the right hip down. I find that more successful if both knees are bent. So if you want to go into that pattern of movement of experiencing the force being created by lifting and pushing into, lifting left hip, pushing into right hip, you may want to come back into constructive rest. And notice the way that as the left hip comes forward, it's a full torso movement. Your torso is arching. That left side is arching. Yeah. If you want to add a little bit more to this, feel the back of your left shoulder blade. And as the left hip lifts, or your left hip comes up towards the ceiling, press your left shoulder blade into the ground. And then release that. Letting your head, neck respond however it wants to. And we're still just looking like, are there sticky spots? Are there certain areas that are harder to go through? And sometimes that's on the force, the movement part, the activity. But other times you'll feel that stickiness and the release. The muscles just don't want to let go. They're like, listen, we're going to do this for you, and we're going to keep doing it for you even after you tell us to turn off, right? So you got to take that extra moment to let them relax. Last one. And before we're going to go on our side to finish up, but before we do, we're going to just take all of these movements into a little bit more of a playful, I call it the playful pelvis. So you can think of your tailbone as your 12 o'clock, your low back and lower ribs as your 6 o'clock, your right hip is your right hip is your 3 o'clock, and your left hip is your 9 o'clock. So much for going in order, right? So 12, 3, 6, and 9, and just move yourself around. We call this the pelvic clock. So you're really taking all of those movements. You're doing the anterior posterior tilt from 12 to 6. You're doing the rotation, one hip lifting, or rotating and lifting. So you're rolling around, keeping the legs quiet and relaxed. Pick one direction first. And experience yourself making these movements through the forces of both pushing into and pulling away from the ground. And what is the healthiest, most easeful way you can create the most motion? So look for things like, are you gritting your teeth? Are you tightening your shoulders? Then probably overdoing it, right? And just rolling it around. I like to roll my head along with it. So again, I think of my nose, the space right underneath my nose likes to follow my tailbone. It accompanies my tailbone in these lovely circles. When you've gotten really good at it, just give your brain a little challenge and switch directions of the circles, which you may be able to do willingly or not. My pelvis likes to do it willingly, my head does not. All part of learning about ourselves through the lovely, playful pelvis. So we're moving everything, all of these different directions, all the planes of the pelvis, we're just exploring. It should feel really nice now, that freedom of movement. And then pausing for a moment. We've got one last one. We're going to isolate one hip at a time. Last movement for today. And now I'm going to roll onto my left side. I only have a block here, so I could put a block underneath my head. But if you have a pillow is much nicer. Your cheek and your ear will appreciate that. But we're going to turn onto our side. Left side, and then I'm going to bring my legs up a little bit so that it looks like I'm sitting in a chair. My thighs are 90 degrees from my spine, and my shins I'm going to bring out to the edge of my mat or blanket so that they're more parallel to my spine. I like to imagine that I have a handle. I do a lot of imagining, don't I? Hope you're with me. But if I have a handle on my outer right hip, and you could use your hand like a handle, place your hand on your hip. And just what we did now with those different planes of movement, we're going to do the same thing, but just from the right hip. So if you're having a hard time moving the hip, so I'm going to make circles with the hip, then what I encourage you to do is bring your awareness into your kneecap. You could push your right kneecap forward and then a little bit down, and then draw it back towards your back of your mat or towards your right hip, and then upward and forward again. So let your inner thighs kind of rub together to find the movement. And your foot might even be moving. I mean, you could do this in a really big way, moving the whole leg. Why not? Might feel good. And notice how much mobility you get when you're rolling around, just feeling, experiencing. And you can switch the direction. So by moving the leg, you're generally going to feel more mobility. But then what happens if the right leg stays still and quiet? I imagine that I've got a little dot of glue between the inner knees, and the inner knees don't move anymore. And can I still move the hips without letting the legs slide over? Can I still find that freedom of movement? And what you may notice is that it's not, the legs are relaxed, so I'm going to get more into my torso muscles above the pelvis as well as into the pelvic muscles themselves. And you can switch the direction. This one can be done on its own. I often do this first thing in the morning, just roll on my side. And notice now that you are so familiar with these planes of the pelvis, when you're going into your duck butt, when you're going into your hip lift or hip drop, and also when you're in your rotation. This being able to just let your right hip swim, playfully swim. So I got that handle, and I think of taking my hip around in nice slow circles. And yeah, we oftentimes want to do this really fast, churn it, right? We don't need to. Go really slow. The slower, the more subtle the movement, the more your nervous system is going to soak up the information. Always that way. Just do a few more rounds with that right hip. Playful with that right pelvis. Sense how it changes the shape of your low back, your abdomen, and then we'll relax completely. Pause for a moment. You can roll into a fetal curl. Just rest in that fetal curl, take a few breaths. Say thank you to your right hip. And then we'll be switching sides. I will turn, so you're not looking at my business end. You don't have to turn, but I'm turning the other way. So now we're at our right side. You can support your head if you'd like. Let your right arm come forward. Bring your thighs up so that they're 90 degrees from the spine, and kick the shins out so that they're parallel to the spine. Just feel your left hip. And think of the handle now on the left hip, and you're taking that handle in circles. You're stirring your left hip. And maybe it's not stirring the way you want it to. So bring the leg in. Think of moving from your kneecap or your shin. Let the left leg slide on the right thigh. Inner thighs sliding together. Or even lift it up and move it around. Open yourself up to finding your full range of motion through that left hip and all three of the planes of movement. You can go both directions. And you'll see too, by lifting up the leg, it's a lot more work for the muscles because now you're got that challenge of gravity. And then I know how much I can move it with the help of the leg, but what if I just let the leg relax? That little drop of glue between the inner knees and the inner calves. And can I still make some soothing circles with the left hip? Feeling how my side body will respond, my waist, my low back, my belly. Picking one direction, just making those circles. Ease of flow and movement. You can switch the direction. Enjoying that rolling. And if you started out the practice noticing that one hip was a little bit grumpier or stickier, does it feel like maybe you've gotten somewhere, maybe you've opened up the line of communication? Because we can have an imbalance. That's the beautiful thing. We can be, we can have these rotations, these hip lifts, but still approach the muscles with this idea that it's okay to have imbalance as long as the muscles will go through the range of motion. It's when the muscles get stuck that we often feel the pain. So just freeing up the muscles to go through the range of motion from contraction to release. And then you can pause again on your side. And I'm going to ask you to find your comfortable position for relaxation, coming onto your back. You can bend your knees or place something underneath your thighs so your hips and your low back are relaxed. So I know from experience, because I have a tilted pelvis still to this day, although these practices that we did today have really helped me to restore some of the balance in my pelvis. But at one point I had over a half an inch difference between my right and left leg, my right leg being shorter because that was the tight side. And that my feet are now equal, or my leg length is equal, because it was never my legs to begin with. It was that my right hip was higher than the left, which makes it appear as if one leg is longer. But I still do have imbalance. I have imbalance in my sacrum. It's tilted. But I know that though it can get crabby at times, these movements, these exercises, these mindful, somatic, inner body practices are a way of acknowledging those sometimes stuck muscles and saying, hey, it's okay, but accepting the imbalance and recognizing that imbalance does not mean pain. That's really important. That we can have, there's many people that have tissue damage that don't feel any discomfort. And then there's other people with very high levels of pain that they can't find tissue damage on, right? So connecting with your nervous system in a way that these practices are really soothing for you, that's what's going to help you with your gait overall. But now finding that position where you can just soothe yourself. And as you do that, I want you to think of something you do that involves you moving through these planes of the pelvis. It could be taking a walk, or hiking, or running, anything else. And visualize yourself doing that with more freedom, more grace, a swagger in your step even. And send that message down into your hips and your pelvis. That message of appreciation for the way it holds together and balances the lower and upper portions of your body. Take some soft, easeful breaths into your lower abdominal region, feeling the movement of the abdomen. Maybe you can even sense your low back moving. Each breath out, just allow the weight of the pelvis, all the bones, those landmarks that we found earlier with our hands, let them just relax into the earth as you breathe out. Fully awake in this area of our body, but also restored and relaxed. That is our natural way of being. Sometimes the muscles just forget. So let the muscles relax. Feel yourself through your bones. Your bones will hold you in this position. Feel the legs as an extension of your pelvis. Softening the backs of the thighs into the ground, backs of the calves. And sense the back and spine all the way from the tail to the tongue. As the pelvis rests and finds comfort, so does the rest of the body. Release your arms and your shoulder blades in the base of the skull. Please feel free to stay here as long as you'd like. Enjoy the softness, comfort of being present in the center of your physical universe. Or if you're ready to finish today, take your hands to your heart center. I encourage you, as you are moving through these planes today, if you're walking, if you're fortunate enough to be in a place where you can be outside. Unfortunately, we've been locked in with cold as much of the country is, and prayer is going out to everyone. But even just walking around your house, notice your gait, your freedom of movement from the pelvis, and how these coordinated movements just occur. We never pay attention to them, but they do. Peace, joy, love, and light. Stay warm.